All right, welcome to another episode of Talk Lex. This will be our first episode in 2 years, so we are really rolling with our consistency here. But we are back better than ever, and we'll be coming back with more episodes more frequently, talking about all the things involving stories of the law in the news. There's tons to be had, tons to be discussed, in particular recently. And that brings us to where we are today. So Giovanna is here. We watched a movie maybe a month and a half ago on Netflix called It Ends With Us with Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, a movie about domestic violence. And it was a massive hit for Netflix, worldwide attention, based on a novel, I believe.
Yes,
And
which I read the novel also.
and everything was all great until it wasn't. And apparently there was some uh, challenges during the promotion of the film, and now it has all blown up into multiple lawsuits involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, their production studios, and most recently Ryan Reynolds being brought into the mix. Without further butchering of the story on my part, I will defer to Giovanna to give the background here.
Okay, so you probably did not follow this as rapidly as I did when it was blowing up kind of in real time, just because I was like a huge Jane the Virgin fan. So Justin Baldoni is probably best known for that. And then I actually love Blake Lively also. Um, so I was following this kind of at the time because things definitely took a turn during the promotion of the movie. And at that time, the public opinion was definitely against Blake Lively. So basically, in a nutshell, this is a book and a movie about an abusive relationship and kind of getting out of that relationship. And there was some talk that they had fumbled the promotion of the movie, and kind of tried to follow in the steps of Barbie, which had been like a gigantic, massive hit just before this, where Margot Robbie like basically dressed like Barbie everywhere. And so now this movie, It Ends With Us, is coming out, and Blake Lively is kind of like, her character owns a flower shop, so she is basically telling people like to put their florals on and to go to the movie with your girlfriends. And a lot of people who were not familiar with the book would have kind of thought that they were promoting more of like a romantic comedy sort of romance type of movie, and not something that had a little bit of a heavier subject matter. And then as this is going on, Justin Baldoni, who had always kind of branded himself as like a feminist ally, and he has a book and a podcast talking about toxic masculinity. Um, and he's all of a sudden starts talking about the domestic violence perspective of this in a very sort of thoughtful and intelligent way, whereas Blake Lively um, seemed to have a little bit of trouble, at least with the clips that became sort of went viral, of kind of fielding questions about domestic violence in sort of a thoughtful and intelligent way. So she, who I think in general had kind of enjoyed some good public opinion, with like her fashion, and she's kind of funny, and she's like Taylor Swift's bestie, and her husband is a, big movie star. All of a sudden, everything you saw about her in the press was really bad. So things start to come out like there was creative differences during like putting the final cut of this movie together. Like, did Blake Lively and her husband kind of take over? But at the same time, like if you're looking at it like me, and who was following basically every little detail about it, there were some red flags that you thought, maybe this isn't what it seems, because everybody who was involved in the movie seemed to be kind of on her side, but nobody really said anything publicly about it. So this kind of, passes, like everything in social media passes after a little while, and kind of you're on to the next. And then about a few weeks ago, this all comes back because she files a lawsuit against him.
Yeah. So as someone who I'm not super active on social media, and I also most of what I see on social media revolves around skiing and golf, so and working out, so and food. So when I saw it, I saw like a couple clips, one of which was some clip of Blake Lively from several years ago acting, I don't know, maybe rude, I guess you would call it, to an interviewer, which in a vacuum seemed kind of strange, but also, I guess, fit with the narrative that she was a difficult person to be around. But which we have come to find out was actually much more well orchestrated, allegedly. So, jumping ahead to what you said, if what seems like a long time ago, but is actually still only a few weeks ago, back in December, this New York Times story drops. It's like a 4,000 word story in the New York Times. So, what is that? What happened with that? What is that all about?
Yeah. So a New York Times article comes out, and it's written, one of the authors of the article is Megan Toohey, and I apologize if I did not pronounce her last name correctly, but she is like a longtime award-winning investigative journalist, and she was one of the women who exposed Harvey Weinstein. So she is a credible journalist. I think she won a Pulitzer for the reporting on Harvey Weinstein, and she and her co-author in that situation, I think, are definitely acknowledged as people who sort of ushered in the Me Too movement. So for her to be one of the authors of this article, I think lends it some credibility. Um, so basically, they expose a complaint that appears to be filed. So, I mean, we're going to get into the legal nitty gritty of this because this is like our wheelhouse and our perspective that we're sort of bringing to this situation as, what does this all mean legally? Because a lot of times when legal stuff and lawsuits are in the news, it's confusing and not really reported in an accurate way. But ultimately, the article is exposing that there's a complaint that's been made in California by Blake Lively against Justin Baldoni and the movie studios that are or production companies that were involved in It Ends With Us. And it's the complaint is accusing him of some misconduct of a sexual nature, not necessarily sexually harassing her in the sense of he's not like asking her out or that type of overt sort of sexual harassment, but inappropriate things certainly coming into her dressing room while she's expressing breast milk because she had just had a baby, showing her some inappropriate videos, and just overall kind of some behavior that she was not comfortable with during the filming of the movie. But really, what her complaint is, I would say, primarily about, and what the article is primarily about, is the retaliation that she's alleging happened after she complained about this. So there was the writer's strike, which made this movie go on hiatus. And then to come back from the writer's strike, she had a meeting, with all the players here with kind of a list of expectations of how the work environment was going to be when they returned. And basically the crux of this complaint and the article is that as it became closer to promoting this movie, there was a concern that she was going to start airing dirty laundry. And to preemptively sort of destroy her credibility, the allegation is that he, using a PR firm and two particular people who are named, kind of set out to preemptively ruin her reputation so that if she did speak out, she would not be believed. Now, if that's true, they were very successful in that because that is what happened. Because even people like me who were a fan of Blake Lively were definitely influenced by the negative press that she got and the little snippets of past interviews that sort of ended up going viral. And now there's kind of this question of, in this day and age with social media, like, can this happen? And it's sort of, so the article I think is more from the perspective of less about like what he allegedly did to her, but more about in this day and age, you can hire these PR firms that can use, the algorithms and boosting posts, et cetera, to like take down anybody, even somebody who prior to that had enjoyed a lot of positive, public attention.
Yeah, I mean, I read the article when it came out. My takeaway was just sort of like, oh, this is really gross. It's like a unfortunate sort of look under the hood of how media manipulation works. And I'm sure this has been going on forever. I don't think manipulating the public is anything new from Hollywood or politicians or anybody else, but it just seems like it's at like light speed now, with the ability to manipulate social feeds. And what was interesting here is the the like blatant level at which they were operating and intentionally trying to take her out. And part of what makes me say that is that the article quotes lots and lots of messages and texts and exchanges that they received, that the New York Times received, um, presumably from Blake Lively's complaint, which brings up another question of like, how did they get this information?
Yeah, so the article refers to the fact that the texts were obtained through a civil subpoena. I don't really know what that they mean by that. It's a little unclear because typically you're not necessarily using a subpoena outside of a legal proceeding. And it's a little bit unclear as to whether there was a legal proceeding pending or not, because typically a complaint made to like a human rights division, whether it's California or New York or whatever, is not publicly accessible. So it's a little questionable what the legal proceedings were going on at that time. Reading between the lines, and I could be wrong, but what it looks like happened, and this is also, a lot of different worlds colliding of kind of employment law and things like that, is one of the public relations people who was involved in this was kind of working for one company and looking to move over to another. And the other, so it's like one woman and another woman are sort of teaming up while one of them is still employed by this other company. And what I think ultimately appears potentially happened is that when, PR lady number one left her job, she gave them back her company cell phone. And then there was a kerfuffle between them of, did you leave under, appropriate circumstances? Did you take documents with you? Did you try to take clients with you? And then when they got it into a dispute, my sense is that her former employer probably provided voluntarily this woman's company cell phone, with all of these text messages on it, which I think is a lesson, multiple, tiered lesson of how to, number one, I think we tell this to all of our clients all the time. Um, everybody uses text to communicate in this day and age. you there is some semblance of the idea that like you have to have in the back of your mind, is my cell phone going to become like exhibit A in a legal dispute? So it's just a lesson to be cautious about that. If you are an employee and you're looking to leave your job, you probably should not be orchestrating that on your company cell phone, which belongs to your company. And everybody has like forensic people that are going to go through your emails and your cell phone and stuff like that when you leave, especially if you don't leave on good terms. So, I reading between the lines and knowing that, the first public relations firm is now suing the former employee. That was my vibe, that that's where these text messages came from, because I don't really see legally outside of a lawsuit how you would get your hands on those.
Yeah, so in New York, you the way subpoenas work in New York is that if you were in a lawsuit as an attorney, you can issue a subpoena essentially for anything you want to anyone you want, and if it's inappropriate, they can make an application to quash or shut it down. Um, Outside of a lawsuit, attorneys can't just go issuing subpoenas to people. There's a mechanism for doing it, but you have to, in New York at least, you have to bring an application to a court and show why you would need this information potentially to aid you in bringing about a lawsuit. Like if you can't identify a party or there's some information that you may need, you can make that application. So maybe something like that happened there. I do suspect that what you're saying is probably true. And to your point, we've seen a number of clients who have left or been fired from uh, businesses where what they left on their work computer or cell phone has come back to bite them. And this case is interesting because, well, so just to jump ahead a bit, so there's this New York Times article. Then there is a an article in Variety, basically highlighting Justin Baldoni, who has then now sued the New York Times for defamation, which we'll get to. Um, and in the interim, Blake Lively's complaint, which was originally filed with some administrative agency in California, has now been filed in the Southern District of New York in federal court, which is a major escalation of these claims for a number of reasons. Number one, federal court, particularly the Southern District, is one of the more serious courts in the country. Number two, everything is now public, and number three, this opens up a a very significant difference in terms of how this all plays out. And now everyone is potentially subject to giving depositions under oath and exchanging discovery of all of the information that they have. But what I was getting at is that the complaint that was filed in the Southern District has, I mean, it's a 96-page complaint. I probably read half of it, and it's got dozens of text messages verbatim among the PR folks between Baldoni and them. And I'm not sure how this all will shake out in the end, but it looks really bad. It looks very clearly like they are out to completely ruin this person's career and try to control this narrative. What do you think about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the text messages are compelling. Justin Baldoni's lawsuit for defamation is basically kind of a defamation almost by omission sort of argument, which we do is recognized in New York, which is basically like, you're giving information that is kind of misleading and then leaving out, something relevant so that you're left with, people are left with a false impression. Because usually an opinion is not, protected. Like she could go out there and be like, he's the worst guy in the whole world, and that's not defamation. So that's my understanding of sort of the basis of what his claims are against the New York Times, which is that, if we read these text messages in context, um, it's not going to look quite as bad as she alleges. Now, the New York Times has said that they read these all in their entirety. And, again, I do think that the journalist does have a lot of credibility. I, my gut is that she would not put her journalistic integrity on the line to like smear Justin Baldoni. It just these players, even Blake Lively being, who she is and who her husband is, these are not like, heads of state or anything like that, that I would think that somebody would put their integrity on the line to write a totally biased, you know, article. I think, these are investigative journalists. They did their investigation and they obviously came to a conclusion, which was that, this is an issue that's happening in this day and age with these kind of PR firms going on this type of smear campaign. And I think it's important to point out, like in Blake Lively's situation, this is basically an employment lawsuit. So this is like exactly what we do. She's not really suing them in some kind of abstract, like you ruined my life sort of thing. So, in order to prevail in an employment lawsuit, you have to prove that you did, in a retaliation case, she has to prove that she made a protected complaint, which is a complaint of sexual harassment, which she did, and that everything that was done against you was because you made that complaint. So, a side, thing that's playing out in the press is, did these people just have a creative breakdown during the process of making this movie and ended up with, like hurt feelings of who's the real producer of the movie and who took creative control of it and who got to pick the music and who got to decide how they were going to market it? And is that really what led to a potentially mutual, because he's alleging that she also went on a negative campaign against him. And that just led to some sort of mutual, like, play it out in the media. You're bad. No, you're worse than me. I would say that that would then not be, I would say that that would make it potentially more difficult for her to prove that she was targeted because of her protected complaint and not for some other reason.
It's going to be interesting because, like I said, now that she's filed a federal complaint, this all has to play out in the legal system. It's not about throwing jabs at each other over social media or through planted articles. It's about sitting in depositions, giving testimony, probably motions by either side, as to the legal merits of the claims. And ultimately, if the case isn't settled, a trial, where a jury can decide who's being credible and who, whether she was actually retaliated against for making a complaint of inappropriate behavior or whether it was a creative difference. So the stakes are raised certainly by the prospect of sitting and giving testimony, I think, more than anything else. Um, I guess it wouldn't surprise me if this was settled at some point. Trials, employment discrimination and retaliation cases are relatively rare. But given the stakes, I would imagine that, and the risks, I would imagine that no one involved here is particularly excited about the prospect of giving testimony.
Yeah, I mean, I think because we handle our cases in a legal context, I do sort of respect people when they use that process, because assuming that your attorney is advising you appropriately of what the risks of wading into that process are, you have really put yourself out there, and the plaintiff has the burden of proving all of this. And you have to stand by your allegations, and you have to be prepared that everything, is going to come out and be scrutinized. Some people, I wanted to also, just kind of check in on some sort of common questions that I've seen about this case kind of playing out on social media. And one of them was, in terms of her filing a lawsuit or filing a complaint, some people said, why did she wait this long? Because it does feel like, was it possible for this to sort of have all kind of blown over and we've kind of forgotten about it? The movie all that press tour stuff was totally over. The movie has since been re-released on Netflix, did very well. So I think, there's sometimes this idea of like, why not let a sleeping dog lie? And, why did you not sue him, at the time or something like that? And I think that, if you are moving forward with a view to a lawsuit, as opposed to some, hashing something out in the court of public opinion or something like that, you do have to get your ducks in a row. And clearly they got their hands on these text messages and sort of did as much due diligence that is possibly, um, available to you before moving forward in a more formal way. They also hired, companies who were able to sort of demonstrate that from the perspective of social media, like, did her uh followers go down? Like, what was the percentage of all of a sudden negative press that she was getting? Like, did the sale of her hair care line go down? And she started getting flooded on her business websites of tons of negative comments. So they kind of compiled all of that data as well before they, moved forward with this, because again, the burden is going to be on her to prove that anything negative that happened to her was because of retaliation and not for some other reason. His argument, and a lot of other people who are not really on her side in this, are saying, any negative feedback that you got and any problems that you had are for your own, because of your own actions. You can't pretend that you didn't say what you said in an interview. This rubbed people the wrong way. And I will say that one of their allegations, because something she did get negative press on, and I agreed with this at the time, being someone who, cares a lot about domestic violence survivors, she really did not field those types of questions well. And now it has since come out, and she has alleged, and they attached this to their complaint, which I read, there was a marketing plan that did instruct them to frame the movie as something more hopeful, as opposed to, and more, about this character's sort of journey in life, as opposed to the domestic violence aspect of it. And what her argument is now is that Justin Baldoni, when he saw that the public opinion was not going in her favor in handling it that way, which she says, I was contractually obligated to do it this way, he went rogue and kind of took on the role of, I'm going to talk about domestic violence. Um, you know, in hindsight, with all of this coming out, that kind of like leaves a bad taste in my mouth that he would kind of capitalize on talking about domestic violence and survivors, sort of like as a man. Not that men can't be victims of domestic violence, but it's just, it like leaves a kind of a bad taste in your mouth that he decided he was going to be the one to, and then to kind of throw her under the bus. That being said, obviously she was going to be asked about it, and at least in the snippets that went viral at the time, she did not feel those questions very well. um but that being said, social media is very, you're being fed what, the algorithm and what people want you to see, and that's what a lot of this lawsuit has to do with. Did they somehow, were they able to like feed, there's like an allegation that one of the PR people had a sister or relative who worked at the New York Post or something, and they were able to feed like it articles from not very reputable websites to more reputable websites, or at least websites that have more followers, to perpetuate like stories about her or videos about past interviews that really would never have had any traction otherwise. So that's kind of part of, like, a little bit scary to think, although at the same time a little bit of like a no-brainer, that you don't really know what you're seeing in many ways. And like, you don't like, why am I seeing this? And is there somebody pulling like puppet strings in the background of like why I'm seeing this? But yeah, I mean, she didn't handle some of the questions appropriately, but my understanding is that in this business, these people do tons and tons of little mini interviews as they promote a movie. And I think most people can agree that you're not always as articulate as you would like to be, and that sometimes anybody could come off-putting. But with the internet, your one bad day can be, you know, shown to the whole universe and make you seem a lot worse than you really are on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's definitely true. But I think it makes it difficult to establish what the damages are. If she's successful, I mean, there's two things you have to prove in a lawsuit. You have to prove liability, meaning they broke the law in one way or another, and then you have to prove what damages are the result of their having broken the law. And I think your points are pretty accurate. You know, I don't know if you say, her reputation was damaged, their response is going to be exactly what you said. Well, yeah, but even if we re-promoted some old clips of her, it's her words. And if people choose not to like her because of that, so what? That's not our problem. We have the right to republish things that she said in the past. And in terms of like articles being kind of planted, this again, that this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. I mean, I think about even in the world of like legal marketing, there are law firms that in order to increase their web presence or get traction on social media or Google, they will pay sort of, questionable outlets to write articles and then link back to their website and then cite them in these articles. And that all gives them, traction and credibility. And it's like it snowballs into gaining, more and more momentum online. And so it's really like an interesting study of, like I said earlier, on like media manipulation in 2024 and 25. I mean, I will be very interested to see how they try to prove damages. That also reinforces my opinion that this is probably a case that will get settled because I think both sides have good arguments in terms of, the challenges that the other faces. So, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Maybe I'm wrong. On the
Yeah, and
timing
I think
question, go ahead.
oh, sorry. And I think, and a lot of this is now blowing up into some, he now has sued the New York Times. Now he um sent like a litigation hold notice to Marvel and the Ryan Reynolds and the people in the Deadpool movie because he thinks that Ryan Reynolds like made fun of him in the movie or something. I mean, some of this stuff I think is becoming a little like taking away from, it's going to start to feel, I think that feels a little bit childish to me. Now, it's normal to send a litigation hold notice to a potential defendant or, um, somebody that you think has evidence. So if they think there's going to be some evidence out there that's being held by Ryan Reynolds or Marvel or whoever made the Deadpool movie, that's not uncommon. A litigation hold notice is basically a letter that your lawyer sends to a company or to their lawyer that just says, don't throw anything away, don't destroy anything, because there's a duty that once you're on notice that you could be part of a legal proceeding, you have a duty not to destroy evidence. That's really common. What to me is starts to get childish in this situation is that that would very rarely be a public. And now, so he or his lawyer or somebody leaked the fact that they served this, or somebody, I mean, maybe it was somebody from, the other side who received it, who leaked it. I don't know. But that kind of stuff can start to like really muddy the waters of what is actually relevant in this case and whatnot. But, so I think it's I would imagine that her intention in moving forward with a lawsuit, even if they were potentially responsible for leaking this information to the New York Times, because obviously they had to get it from somewhere, I would say would have been maybe to avoid some of this circus, because I don't know that any of them are coming out, you know, in a positive light now at this point. Um, I don't know. I feel like Justin Baldoni, for me to like be suing the New York Times and then sending these things and then making a big deal about like, did he make fun of me in the Deadpool movie? I don't really know how much that is helping
Yeah, I
his
mean,
public image either.
yeah, it all feels a little bit desperate, I think. I mean, defamation cases are hard to win just in general, and when you've got a media outlet talking about public figures, the standard is incredibly high to win a defamation case. Um, but it doesn't prevent people from suing. I mean, the New York Times and major publications get sued all the time for defamation. So I suspect this is not something they will roll over on. They usually have very good First Amendment lawyers, one of whom I think you used to work for. I don't know if he's still practicing, but
I worked at his firm for a
yeah.
summer in New York City, but yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Just quickly on the issue of the timing, it's funny because people will say, well, why did she wait this long, which you touched on? We see this all the time in lawsuits. When you're a plaintiff, you really can't win. If you file a lawsuit close to whenever the problem happened, people will claim that you're litigious. If you wait too long, they'll ask you why you waited too long. Um, this is actually kind of a sweet spot in terms of timing for filing a lawsuit. It's about a year after some of this stuff, happened, some of it came out. I suspect, being that Blake Lively had a vested financial interest in this movie, that she probably wanted to wait until the movie came out and maybe, let it run a little bit. The movie made tons of money for Netflix, probably for them as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was some, thought process of, maybe we wait until this has, a little bit of time has passed. But it's hard from a plaintiff's perspective because you're gonna get blamed either way.
Yeah. And just kind of procedurally, in employment lawsuits, to protect your rights under the federal law, you have to file EEOC charges and you have to wait 180 days for the EEOC to do an investigation before you're even allowed to sue on something like a Title VII claim, which is what she has in her Southern District of New York complaint. Now, I will say that I'm a little bit confused procedurally, as to whether that happened or not, because it's not alleged in the complaint. Typically, you're required to allege that in the complaint. I don't know how the California complaint, really fits in with that. This New York complaint does have violations of California statutes in it, which you are allowed to do that. But it's also a little bit curious that the case was sued in New York and not California. She does live in New York, and they're alleging that some of the wrongdoing happened in New York, and at least one of the defendants, I think, does some business in New York. But I will be interested to see how it plays out, just from a more like nerdy litigator perspective, how it plays out that this case is in the Southern District, which, yes, is very strict about employment cases. Like, employment cases have like a very specific track in the Southern District of documents that you have to exchange right off the bat. And it's like a very dialed in process. Um, and then just with those kinds of prerequisites, like you have to have gotten a right to sue from the EEOC to file a Title VII claim. But that just also speaks to the timing of things. Like, you can't just typically go and just sue an employment case like the day after something bad happens to you. But I did want to touch on something that we didn't necessarily talk about yet, which is just some of the negative feedback that she's gotten, is also, if something bad was happening on this movie, you're rich, your husband is rich, why didn't you quit?
Yep.
Um, and not to throw her under the bus, but my mom, who is like a Gloria Steinem level feminist, actually said that to me. So my response to that would be, from an employment law perspective, I think she did exactly what she was supposed to do and exactly what I would advise someone who is still employed, which is to complain. And that's exactly what she did. And that's why this case is a little bit more about retaliation than the harassment or discrimination or something like that. Because she obviously didn't lose her job. And she's not really accusing him of the type of harassment that is going to like drive somebody out the door necessarily. You know, was it uncomfortable what she's alleging? Was it inappropriate? Yes. But there's a standard as to the level of harassment that is going to send somebody out the door and then allow them to, you know, sue their employer. So she did what we would encourage anybody to do unless they were sort of in physical danger, which is to make a complaint and put the ball in their court and have them make it right. Um, and it sounds like if they had not gone on this anti Blake Lively PR blitz, that's kind of what happened. Like they had these meetings, they entered into an agreement, they went back to work, and they finished the movie. Um, you know, I think from her perspective, perhaps then it would have been over. Now, maybe they then ultimately had all of these crazy creative differences and huge falling out by the time the movie was over and being put together. Like the author of the book is on her team, like all of her co-stars are on her side, which I do think gives her some credibility as well. But ultimately, it's this negative campaign against her that has caused, you know, all of these subsequent sort of legal proceedings. But, you know, and just from a more, and I think, you know, the response to that, you know, oh yeah, yes, you're supposed to complain, but still she had the resources to leave anyway. She didn't have to do that. I mean, I would say that from a more, you know, women's rights or anybody's rights perspective, why should the victim have to leave? You know, she didn't do anything wrong at that point. Why should she have to leave? I mean, she may have, you know, be kind of a celebrity and her husband is a movie star, but she has not headlined, you know, very many big movies. And this movie was, people knew it was going to be big because the book is like a huge bestseller. And she hasn't really been like the star of a huge movie. So this was like a big opportunity for her as well. So I feel like, you know, from my perspective, like why should she have to leave? Like he's acting inappropriate, like go complain about him and he's responsible for his behavior and fix it. And why should she have to, plus she has a contract. I mean, it's like not so
Well,
simple. You know, these people have contracts, like they, you know, it's not like you're working at some normal, you know, private business with no employment contract and you can kind of do whatever you want.
yeah, well, it's also practically if she left the movie, she would have gotten really bad press anyway. And they probably wouldn't have spun it positively towards her. But, you know, as I often respond to people when they ask me why I didn't change my name when my uh, namesake out in California has been in the news for approaching 20 years. And I cite Michael Bolton from Office Space, which is why should I change my name when he's the one who sucks, right? It's why should she have to? She shouldn't have to do that. She didn't do anything wrong. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think she handled that situation appropriately. You know, whatever happened after, you know, seems to be a little bit more murky in terms of how this all went down. But, you know, ultimately she has to prove her claims. And that's, you know, that's a risk that people take. And I respect that because, you know, you could easily just continue hashing this out over social media or whatever. You know, but if you take this step, then you have to kind of follow the rules and follow the process.
Yeah, I agree. I think she did exactly what we tell people all the time to do, which is follow the process, let them make the mistake, and then you have a stronger legal case, which she probably does because of that. All right. So takeaways. What are your takeaways from this? And before you say, my main takeaway here is, like I said in the beginning, an increasing cynicism of media and social media in particular, because it's just a reminder that you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes, and it's amazing how easily the narrative is manipulated. I laugh because my mom, whenever she likes to watch the show with Kelly Ripa and her husband, I think. And
Yeah.
whenever a celebrity is on the show, she calls me and says, "Oh, I saw, so and so on the show, and he seems like such a nice guy." And my response is always the same, which is, "You have absolutely no idea what that person is like. That's just what they're showing you. And maybe they're nice and maybe they're not. I have no idea, but this is just a very like blatant example of like how the manipulation works, and that you just don't know. You can't believe like half of what you see. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah. Well, I I don't want to echo you, but that was kind of my takeaway as well. But I will say it from the perspective of I think this shows, and a lot of people, when I was seeing a lot of like, I'm not on Twitter or X or anything, so sometimes I look at like just threads. So when I was seeing people talking about this, a lot of people, especially a lot of women, were saying, I feel like I was duped, like I believed this, and like myself, like I was a fan of hers, and I really like took his side on this and really, you know, kind of changed my whole opinion of her. And, again, like, yes, I think we can hold people accountable for, was it in poor, did she field some questions wrong? Yes. Was it people felt that, she overexposed herself because she was releasing a hair product line. Now, a lot of this complaint, especially the original complaint in the New York Times article, do explain some of the context of that. Like, for example, her hair care line launch was planned like a year or more in advance versus the premiere of the movie. So there was a lot of explanation of things that kind of made her look bad that in hindsight, now that you know the context of it, it's like she's sort of, you can view it in a little bit of a different light. So I would say part of my takeaway is not only that you have to be cautious about what you're seeing, and the footnote to that being that I personally find it extremely exhausting at this point in time to put in the mental energy to figure out like what is true and what is not. There's like California wildfires like being an example of just having to weed through a lot of misinformation, a lot of really biased information. Um, but also I think it's a lesson in either withholding judgment or at least being willing to change your mind when new information comes to light. Like, I think I don't know, people talk about this with politics and whatever. Like, people are very, they do not want to change their mind. And I think that, like, being in our profession where part of your job is to like persuade a judge to your point of view, like we know that it is possible to change someone's mind based on facts primarily and then your arguments. So I think, this is an example of like people being willing to admit and who knows how this will all shake out in the long run, but people appeared to be willing to admit that they had been deceived, potentially, allegedly deceived into just like some current events that have happened where, people may have been told one set of facts that was not reality and do not want to accept that they may have been deceived. I think is something that is kind of one of my takeaways.
Yeah, and this is self-serving, but this to me this shows the importance, the continued importance of like the legal system because it's a forum in which you have facts actually matter and people actually get to sit down and hear everything and make a determination as to what's true and what's not. And that's the beauty of a jury trial is that, people may think that they know, but when they actually sit down and they hear and they make credibility determinations, that it's not just one side, you often find that that's a good place for people to change their mind because they actually see what the true story is.
Yeah,
Um,
and just to add one little tiny thing to that, because I know we're going to wrap up, is we have a prior episode on the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, and when you're talking about going through a trial, that is an example of the trial going in a way that may have been surprising to some people, but it was based on, a jury viewing the credibility of these witnesses and ultimately, not believing Amber Heard and her side of things. Now, the conspiracy theorist in me will say, and some people are bringing this up, is that the same PR firm that allegedly destroyed Blake Lively's reputation is also the PR firm that was hired by Johnny Depp, as well as Brad Pitt, who has also come out smelling like a rose, even though he is like an alleged abuser. But people hate Angelina Jolie because they think she's like a white husband stealer, homewrecker. But there is something definitely kind of out there about women being vilified when they make these complaints. Like no matter how evolved we think we are after Me Too, women do tend to take the brunt of the negative press in these situations. But again, the Amber Heard trial is an example of that was the legal system. That wasn't just the public saying, we don't believe you, we hate women. They went through that process and a jury decided that they did not, find her credible.
that's
Her situation is different. But ultimately that is the what will happen here.
yeah,
Somebody is going to look at this in an objective way and figure out what's going on.
and that's the best we've got. There's really at this point. So until AI takes over and makes credibility determinations based upon, every non verbal cue. But let's hope that doesn't happen anytime soon because we'll be out of a job then. Um, all right, so we're gonna wrap there. We will be back much more consistently with discussions of all things legal in the news. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, follow our show, and we will see you again soon. Any last parting words?
Beware of LL Bean websites purporting to sell their goods for 90% off, a scam that one of our family members, who will remain nameless, was recently the victim of.
Maybe we can touch on that in a later episode. Oh man. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll see everyone soon.
Right.